Tobias Warren's hammer froze mid-swing when he saw Edna Collins pour half a bottle of fever tonic into an empty vial, cap it, and slip the diminished original back onto her wagon shelf as though nothing were wrong. He set the hammer down on the anvil's horn, the forge fire hissing behind him, and crossed the muddy square toward her wagon without bothering to roll down his sleeves. Sammy Doyle, 6 years old and burning with ague, sat wrapped in a blanket on his mother's lap nearby, his small chest working too hard for the thin spring air. Edna knelt at the wagon's open side, measuring careful drops into a spoon, her lips moving as she counted, her dark honey-colored hair coming loose from its pins beneath her traveling bonnet. "That is not a full dose," Tobias said. It was not an accusation. It came out low, almost gentle, but it stopped her hand. She looked up at him, and for a moment he saw the exhaustion she had been hiding behind that composed, schoolroom posture of hers ever since she had come west the autumn before to take up her father's practice. Her eyes, gray as river stone, held his without flinching, though he could see the fine tremble in her fingers. "It is enough to bring the fever down for 6 hours," she said. "By then his mother will have him cooled with cloths and I will have thought of something else." "You are rationing," he said. "I am managing," she corrected, and there was steel in it, the kind he had not expected from a woman who wore lace at her collar and carried a leather satchel full of Latin words. "Mr. Warren, I appreciate your concern, but I have been keeping this settlement in medicine since October, and I intend to keep doing so." Tobias was a big man, built from years of swinging iron rather than any inheritance of privilege, his forearms thick and corded beneath rolled shirt sleeves, his shoulders wide enough that he had to duck through most doorways in Larkspur. His dark hair, longer than fashion favored in the cities back east, was tied back at his neck with a leather cord, and a beard shadowed a jaw that had been set stubborn since the day his brother died in a rockfall 3 winters past. He had built half the tools in this canyon settlement with his own 2 hands, shod every horse from here to the toll bridge, and he did not know the first thing about tinctures or dosages, but he knew rationing when he saw it because he had rationed nails and coal and hope enough times himself. "How low are you?" he asked. She hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. "The quinine is nearly gone," she admitted at last quietly, so Mrs. Doyle would not hear. "The carbolic acid is gone entirely. I sent an order to Higgins's apothecary in Canyon City 3 weeks past, and the wagon road washed out below Widow's Bend before it could come through. I have been waiting on the mail rider, but he says the high trail will not open for freight until the creeks drop, and that could be another fortnight." "A fortnight is too long for that boy," Tobias said, glancing at Sammy Doyle's flushed little face. "I know that, Mr. Warren. I am a physician's daughter and a licensed pharmacist. I do not need you to tell me what I already know." He did not argue with her. He simply turned and walked back toward the forge, and when she called after him, confused, he did not stop to explain himself. He banked the fire, hung his leather apron on its peg, and saddled the gray gelding he kept for the mountain trails rather than the shoeing work. By the time Edna Collins came hurrying across the square, her skirts gathering mud, he already had 1 boot in the stirrup. "Where do you think you are going?" "Canyon City," he said. "The ridge trail is still passable for a man on horseback, even where the wagon road is not. I have ridden it a dozen times this spring alone, checking snares. That is a full day's ride each way, through slide country, and you have a business to run here. People need their plow blades mended and their horses shod. You cannot simply write me a list," he said, cutting her off not unkindly. "You know better than I do what that boy needs, and what the rest of your patients will need before the road opens proper. I have coin saved. I will pay Higgins myself and settle accounts with you after." She stood there in the mud, staring up at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between offense and astonishment, and for a long moment he thought she might refuse out of pure pride. Then Sammy Doyle coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and something in her face changed. "Quinine sulfate 2 ounces," she said quickly, pulling a pencil and a scrap of paper from her satchel and writing as she spoke. "Carbolic acid 1 pint. Tincture of opium, laudanum, 4 ounces, though tell Mr. Higgins I want the newer preparation, not the old stock he tried to sell my father. Calomel, willow bark extract if he has any fresh, clean muslin bandages, and if he has come into any carbolized catgut for sutures, I want all of it he can spare. She thrust the list at him. Tell him it is for Edna Collins, and that I will send payment within the week regardless of what you spend of your own money, Mr. Warren. I do not accept charity. Wasn't offering charity, he said, tucking the list into his coat. Offering a horse that can cross Widow's Bend without drowning. For the first time since he had known her, she almost smiled. He was gone before noon, and the ridge trail proved every bit as treacherous as he had promised. Snowmelt had turned the switchbacks to soup, and twice his gelding slid to its hocks in mud before finding footing again. Where the main wagon road below had washed away entirely, swallowed by the swollen creek, Tobias urged his horse up along the old game trail that hugged the canyon wall, past scree fields still shedding rock from the spring thaw, the roar of the river far below a constant reminder of what waited for any misstep. He reached Canyon City as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, his horse blowing hard, his own back aching from the ride. Higgins's apothecary sat on the main street near the rail depot, its windows lit yellow against the dusk. The old druggist looked up when Tobias came through the door trailing mud and cold air, and something guarded crossed his face when Tobias read out the list and named Edna Collins. I cannot extend her any more credit, Higgins said, folding his arms over his apron. A man came through here not 10 days back, said he worked for Mr. Silas Pemberton up in Larkspur, said Miss Collins's accounts might be frozen pending some court matter, and that I would do well not to fill any large orders on her name until it was settled. Tobias felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the ride. Court matter. That is all I know, Higgins said. I do not involve myself in other men's business, but if you are paying cash, Mr. Warren, I will fill the order gladly and gladly again. Tobias emptied his coin purse onto the counter, every dollar he had saved toward a new set of bellows, and watched Higgins wrap bottles in newspaper and pack them into a canvas satchel. He asked as casually as he could manage when the court matter concerned, and Higgins only shrugged and said something about a guardianship hearing, a judge riding circuit through Larkspur within the month, and a niece or a ward, he could not recall which, being examined for her fitness to manage an inheritance. Tobias thanked him, shouldered the satchel, and rode back through the dark with more on his mind than mud and rockslides. He reached Larkspur near dawn, exhausted, mud-caked to the thigh, and found Edna still awake, sitting up with Sammy Doyle's mother in the small room she used as both surgery and shop. When he set the satchel on her counter, she opened it with hands that shook slightly, and when she found everything she had asked for, she looked up at him with an expression that undid something in his chest more thoroughly than any blow from a hammer ever had. You rode through the night, she said. Wasn't going to leave a boy feverish for want of quinine, he said, and then, because he could not help himself, Higgins mentioned a court matter concerning you, Miss Collins, something about a guardianship. The warmth in her face shuddered as quickly as it had come. That, she said, is a matter I intend to handle myself. Thank you for the medicine, Mr. Warren. I mean that sincerely. But I would ask that you not trouble yourself further with my affairs. He nodded, because that was what a gentleman did, but as he walked back to his cold forge in the gray light of morning, he found he could not quite make himself stop troubling over her at all. The full truth came out 3 days later, when the circuit judge, Harlan Whitfield, arrived in Larkspur to hold his spring session in the back room of the trading post that doubled as courthouse whenever the law came through. Tobias had not intended to attend, but a summons found him at the forge that morning nonetheless, delivered by the same clerk who had apparently warned Higgins off extending credit to Slim, well-dressed young man named Wendell Ashford, who introduced himself as an associate of Mr. Silas Pemberton, and asked, with a smile too polished for a canyon settlement, whether Tobias would consent to testify as to what he had witnessed regarding Miss Collins's conduct of her business. The back room was crowded with townsfolk when Tobias arrived, most of them patients of Edna's father over the years, all of them curious. Silas Pemberton sat near the judge's table, a heavy-set man in a fine black coat, silver-headed cane resting against his knee, his face arranged into an expression of sorrowful concern that Tobias distrusted on principle. Edna sat across the aisle, spine straight, hands folded, in a gray traveling dress that made her look younger and more alone than Tobias had ever seen her. Judge Whitfield, a lean, gray-whiskered man who had ridden circuits through these mountains for 20 years, called the room to order and explained, for the benefit of those who did not already know, that Dr. Josiah Collins, before his death 2 winters past, had left his entire estate, his apothecary practice, his modest house, and the parcel of land at the eastern approach to the Larkspur Toll Bridge, to his only child, Edna, with the provision that Silas Pemberton should serve as executor and guardian of her financial affairs, until such time as she demonstrated, to the court's satisfaction, sufficient competence to manage them alone. It was, the judge noted dryly, an old-fashioned clause, the kind a worried father sometimes wrote into a will to protect a daughter from fortune hunters, never imagining it might instead be turned into a cage. Pemberton rose first. He spoke at length and smoothly of Edna's delicate constitution, her lack of business training, her habit. Here he gestured toward Tobias without quite looking at him, of sending men to conduct her affairs rather than managing them herself, as evidenced by the recent supply run to Canyon City. He suggested, with practiced sorrow, that a young woman alone on the frontier, however well-intentioned, could not be expected to shoulder the burden of an inheritance that included valuable land now sought after by a mining syndicate eager to purchase the bridge right-of-way for a toll road. Better, surely, that the court extend his guardianship indefinitely, for her own protection. Wendell Ashford testified next, producing a ledger he claimed showed irregularities in Edna's accounts, purchases unaccounted for, debts unpaid, though when Judge Whitfield asked him to point to a specific figure, Ashford's confidence wavered and his numbers did not quite hold together under the judge's patient, repeated questioning. Then Edna stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She produced her own ledger, kept in a neat, disciplined hand, and walked the judge through every transaction of the past 6 months, every tonic sold, every debt forgiven for families too poor to pay, every dollar spent on stock, and every dollar owed to her in return. She explained, plainly and without apology, that she had sent Tobias Warren to Canyon City not because she was incapable of the journey herself, but because a child was feverish and could not wait the 2 days a round trip would require if she went alone and closed her practice in the meantime. She said she had trained 4 years at the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, had assisted her father in surgery since she was 15 years old, and had kept this settlement in medicine single-handedly since his death without a single patient lost to want of proper care. "I do not dispute that I am a woman alone in a hard country, Your Honor," she said. "I dispute that this makes me incapable. I would ask the court to test me, rather than take Mr. Pemberton's word for my failings, since I notice he has produced no evidence beyond his own concern, and Mr. Ashford's ledger cannot even withstand simple arithmetic." A ripple of quiet laughter went through the room. Pemberton's face reddened. Judge Whitfield considered a long moment, tapping his pencil against the table, and Tobias found himself holding his breath along with the rest of the room. "I will not decide a woman's competence on the strength of speeches from either side," the judge said finally. "I will decide it on results. The spring thaw is closing the high trail to freight within the week, once the creeks crest, and it will not reopen until the water drops, likely a month or more. Miss Collins's apothecary is nearly bare. I am ordering that she travel to Canyon City herself, conduct the full resupply of her practice in her own name and by her own hand, negotiate the purchase and the credit terms personally, and return before the pass closes 8 days, no more. She will manage every transaction herself. Mr. Ashford will accompany her as an impartial observer on Mr. Pemberton's behalf to report to this court on her conduct. And given the difficulty of the trail this time of year, I am assigning Mr. Tobias Warren, who I understand knows these mountains better than any man in this settlement, to guide and protect the party. If Miss Collins completes this journey and conducts her business competently, this guardianship ends the day she returns. Is that understood by all parties? Pemberton's mouth tightened, but he could hardly object to a test he had all but demanded. Edna's chin lifted, and for the briefest moment her eyes met Tobias's across the crowded room, and he saw something there he recognized from his own reflection some mornings: fear, carefully hidden behind resolve. "Understood, Your Honor," she said. They left Larkspur 2 mornings later, 3 riders and 2 pack mules threading down out of the settlement toward the switchback trail that climbed the canyon wall before dropping again toward Canyon City. The river below ran high and brown with snowmelt, loud enough that they had to raise their voices to be heard over it in places, and mud sucked at the mules' hooves with every step. Tobias rode ahead, choosing the path, and it took him less than an hour to conclude that Wendell Ashford had never sat a horse on anything rougher than a city park bridle path. The younger man clutched his reins too tight, flinched at every loose stone that clattered down the slope, and twice nearly steered his mount off the trail's edge entirely while trying to keep his fine boots clear of mud splatter. "You would do better to trust the horse," Tobias told him after the second near miss. "He knows this ground better than either of us." "I am not accustomed to mountain travel, Mr. Warren," Ashford said stiffly. "I am a man of business." "Then be a man of business, and let the horse do the mountain travel." Edna, riding behind them with the easy seat of someone who had grown up around horses, even if she had not grown up in these particular mountains, caught Tobias's eye and did not quite hide her amusement. It was the first genuine warmth he had seen from her since the hearing, and something in him eased at the sight of it, though he could not have said why it mattered so much that she was not afraid. By midday they reached the first real obstacle, a stretch of trail where the spring thaw had undercut the hillside, sending a slab of mud and rock down across the path in the night, narrowing it to little more than a goat track along the canyon edge, with a 100-foot drop to the river below. Ashford took one look and declared in a voice that cracked slightly that they should turn back and wait for the county to clear it. "County will not clear a game trail," Tobias said. "This is the only way through short of a 2-day detour we do not have time for. Walk your horses. Keep to the uphill side. I will lead." He dismounted and led his own gelding across first, testing each step, feeling the ground shift treacherously beneath his boots in places. Edna followed on foot as well, leading her mare with a calm, steady hand, murmuring low words to the animal that Tobias suspected were more for her own nerves than the horse's. Ashford came last, white-faced, and it was his lead mule, laden with empty crates for the return trip, that balked halfway across, planting its feet and refusing to move, exactly at the narrowest point of the slide. "Do not pull at him," Edna said sharply, before Ashford's frightened yanking on the lead rope could send the mule stumbling toward the edge. She handed her own mare's reins to Tobias and moved past Ashford without hesitation, speaking low and even to the mule, running a steady hand down its neck, and after a long, tense moment, the animal huffed and consented to walk on. "You have a way with animals," Tobias said, once they were all safely across and the trail widened again. "I have a way with anything frightened," Edna said, a little breathless from the encounter, tucking a loose strand of hair back beneath her bonnet. "It is mostly a matter of not being frightened back at them." He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon's ride, turning it over the way he might turn over a piece of iron before deciding how best to shape it. That night they camped in a stand of pine above the worst of the mud, where Ashford complained about the cold and the hardness of the ground, and retired to his bedroll early, leaving Tobias and Edna alone by the fire with the mules picketed nearby and the river's distant roar for company. You did not have to send him to check the picket lines twice just to have a moment's peace, Tobias said, amused, once Ashford's second errand had taken him well out of earshot. I did not send him, Edna said, though the corner of her mouth twitched. I merely mentioned twice that I thought I heard the mules restless. Tobias laughed, low and real, and it surprised him how easily it came around her. How did a Philadelphia pharmacist end up in a canyon in Colorado? He asked, shoeless mules and rockslides and all. She was quiet a moment, feeding a stick into the fire, watching the sparks rise. My father came west when I was 12, she said. My mother had died the year before, of a fever he could not treat fast enough, and I think he never forgave the city for that, though it was not the city's fault. He wanted mountain air, clean water, a place where he thought he might do some good that mattered. I stayed behind to finish my schooling, and I always meant to join him once I had my license, though I confess I imagined something rather more genteel than mud up to my knees and mules that will not walk. And your father? Pneumonia, 2 winters ago. I arrived 4 months after he was buried. Her voice did not waver, but something in the firelight caught the grief still sitting behind her eyes. I could have sold the practice and gone home. Everyone assumed I would. Mr. Pemberton certainly assumed I would, which I believe is half of why he is so aggrieved that I did not. What made you stay? Because these people needed a doctor, and I was the only one who knew how to be one, she said simply. And because I think my father would have wanted his work to continue, not to be auctioned off to the highest bidder the moment he was gone. What of you, Mr. Warren? What brought a blacksmith to a canyon at the end of the world? He was quiet a long moment, the fire popping between them. My brother and I came out together after the war, he said finally. There was nothing left for us back home worth staying for. He worked a mining claim 2 seasons before a shaft collapsed on him. I could have gone home after that. Everyone assumed I would. He gave her a small, wry look, echoing her own words back at her, and she smiled despite herself. But somebody had to keep the settlement's tools mended, and I found I did not mind the mountains keeping me company instead of people most days. Most days, she repeated softly. And other days. He looked at her across the fire for a long moment, and did not quite have an answer he was ready to give voice to yet. They broke camp before first light, and the second day's ride proved harder than the first. The trail dropped steeply toward a creek crossing that in a dry season would have been a simple ford, but the spring thaw had swollen it into a churning, brown torrent that swallowed the usual crossing stones entirely. We wait, Ashford said immediately, eyeing the water with open fear. We wait for it to drop. It will not drop before nightfall, and the judge's 8 days will not wait either, Tobias said. He studied the water a long moment, noting where it narrowed between 2 boulders upstream, and dismounted. There is a place we can rope across. I will go first, secure a line, and bring the animals over one at a time. He tied a length of rope to his saddle horn, looped the other end around his waist, and worked his way upstream along the bank to the narrower crossing, the roar of the water making conversation impossible. Edna watched him go with her jaw tight, and when he finally waded in, fighting the current with the full strength of his broad shoulders and thick legs, she found she could not look away. He made it across, driving a stout branch into the bank on the far side and securing the rope, and began working the animals over one by one, wading back into the current each time to steady them against the pull of the water. It was on the 3rd crossing, guiding Ashford's mule through the worst of the flow, that a submerged branch, torn loose somewhere upstream, slammed into Tobias's side and knocked him from his footing. Edna did not scream, though her heart lurched into her throat. She watched him go under, watched the rope snap taut as his weight hit it, and then she was moving, unlacing her boots with hands that did not shake despite everything, wading into the freezing water along the rope's length before Ashford could even find his voice to object. "Stay back," Tobias managed, surfacing, blood already welling from a gash along his forearm where the branch had struck him. But Edna was already there, bracing her feet against a submerged rock, hauling on the rope alongside him with a strength that startled him even through the cold and the pain. Between the two of them, they got him to the bank, the mule scrambling out just behind, and Tobias lay for a moment on the muddy grass, breathing hard, blood running pink into the water pooling around his arm. "That was foolish," he said, once he had breath enough to speak, though there was no real anger in it. "That was necessary," Edna said, already opening her satchel with steady, practiced hands, ignoring her own soaked skirts and the cold biting into her. "Hold still." She cleaned the wound with carbolic solution from one of the bottles she herself had helped select in her own careful hand, and stitched the gash closed with quick, sure movements, her face a study of calm concentration even as Tobias watched her with something closer to wonder than pain. "You have done this before," he said. "More times than I would like to count," she said. "Frontier surgery does not wait for delicate sensibilities, Mr. Warren, mine, or anyone else's." She tied off the last stitch and looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. "You saved every animal and every crate on this trip today. Let me save your arm in return. It seems only fair." "Seems more than fair," he said quietly. "Seems like the first time in a long while anyone's looked after me instead of the other way around." Something passed between them then, unspoken but unmistakable, and it was Ashford's nervous cough from a few feet away, forgotten in the drama of the crossing, that finally broke the moment. They reached Canyon City by the fourth evening, later than planned but within the judge's window still, and Edna wasted no time proving the point the entire journey had been meant to test. She walked into Higgins's apothecary the next morning with her ledger under one arm and negotiated the full resupply of her practice herself: quinine, carbolic acid, laudanum, calomel, bandages, surgical instruments, and a dozen other necessities, counting out payment from funds she had carefully saved and arranging credit terms for the balance with a clarity that left even skeptical old Higgins nodding in grudging respect. Ashford, for his part, spent the visit hovering at Edna's elbow with an air of polished concern that Tobias found himself disliking more with each passing hour, though he told himself it was only because the man's presence seemed calculated rather than genuine. "You handle a ledger better than most bankers I have known, Miss Collins," Ashford said, as they left the apothecary with the first crates loaded. "It is a rare thing, in a woman especially. Mr. Pemberton, I confess, has rather underestimated you. I intend to say so in my report." "How generous," Edna said, in a tone Tobias was learning to recognize as her particular brand of polite skepticism. "I only wish," Ashford continued, matching his stride to hers, "that circumstances might allow us better acquaintance under less adversarial terms. A woman of your accomplishments deserves rather finer company than mountain trails and mule trains, if I may say so." Tobias, walking a few steps behind with a crate balanced on one shoulder, felt something tighten unpleasantly in his chest at that, and it was only later that evening, as they settled the last of the supplies into the wagon they had arranged to hire for the return, that he found himself asking Edna about it more bluntly than he intended. "Ashford seems taken with you," he said. Edna glanced up from the crate she was checking, surprised, then something like understanding crossed her face. "Ashford is taken with whatever serves Mr. Pemberton's purposes," she said. "He has been polite to me the entire journey because Mr. Pemberton wants a favorable report, or because he hopes to charm me into some indiscretion he can use against me in court. I am not fool enough to mistake flattery for sincerity, Mr. Warren, and I would thank you not to be either, on my behalf." "I wasn't jealous," Tobias said, which was not entirely true, and they both seemed to know it. "I did not say you were." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "Though if you were, I would tell you plainly that Mr. Ashford's fine words interest me a great deal less than the fact that you rode through the night in the mud for a feverish child you had never even met, and asked for nothing in return but the truth about a court matter you had every right to walk away from. He did not have a ready answer for that, but the warmth in his chest lingered long after the conversation ended, and he found himself watching her across the campfire that night with an attention that had very little to do with rockslides or mule trains. It was the following afternoon, while Edna finalized the last of her paperwork at the freight office, that Tobias overheard the conversation that changed everything. He had stepped into the small telegraph office beside the depot to send word ahead to Larkspur that the party would be returning within the judge's deadline, and there, in the corner near the stove, he recognized a thin, nervous man in a rumpled coat arguing in hushed tones with the telegraph clerk about the next departing train to Denver. "Mr. Finch," the clerk said, not unkindly, "the eastbound does not leave until 4 o'clock. You have hours yet." "I know when it leaves," the man snapped, twisting his hat in his hands. "I am only asking you to hold my ticket at the window so I do not have to stand about where anyone might see me." Tobias had never met Aldous Finch, but he had heard the name once before, in passing, from Higgins the apothecary, who had mentioned that Pemberton's old bookkeeper had left the bank rather suddenly the previous month, and no one quite knew why. Something about the man's furtive manner, the way his eyes kept darting toward the door, struck Tobias as worth a closer look. He approached carefully, the way he might approach a spooked horse, and introduced himself as a friend of Edna Collins, watching the name land like a struck bell. "Collins," Finch repeated, going pale. "The doctor's daughter." "The one Pemberton is trying to—" He stopped himself, glancing around the small office as though the walls themselves might report back to his old employer. "Trying to what, Mr. Finch?" Finch was quiet a long moment, and Tobias could see the war happening behind the man's eyes, fear pulling one direction, conscience pulling another. "I kept Mr. Pemberton's ledgers for 6 years, Finch said finally, low and fast. 6 years, and I never asked too many questions, because a man has to feed his family and Pemberton pays well for men who do not ask questions. But when Dr. Collins died, I was the one who drew up the paperwork transferring the deed to that bridgeside parcel out of the estate and into a mining syndicate's name, at Pemberton's instruction, with a signature on it I do not believe Dr. Collins ever gave, because the ink was fresher than the date on the page, and I know fresh ink when I see it. Mr. Warren, 6 years of ledgers will teach a man that much. Pemberton's been paid a fine commission by that syndicate for arranging the sale, quietly, and if that guardianship ever lapses without the transfer being challenged, it stands. That is why he needs Miss Collins declared unfit, or at least delayed long enough that the transfer goes unquestioned past the point anyone can undo it. You have proof of this." Finch's hand went instinctively to the worn leather satchel at his side. "I kept copies, told myself it was for my own protection, in case Pemberton ever tried to blame the forgery on me instead. I was going to disappear to Denver and forget the whole business, live with myself as best I could. But I have not slept right in a month, Mr. Warren, and I do not intend to start sleeping right by watching a young woman lose her father's land to a lie I helped write." "Then do not board that train," Tobias said. "Come with us. Tell the judge what you just told me." Finch's face went through fear, doubt, and something that looked almost like relief before he finally nodded, and Tobias felt something in his chest ease with a force that surprised him, until a familiar voice spoke from the doorway behind them. "I would not do that, Mr. Finch, if I were you." Wendell Ashford stood there, his polished demeanor gone entirely, replaced by something colder and more calculating than Tobias had yet seen from him. "Mr. Pemberton has been generous to men who keep his confidences," Ashford said, stepping into the office, "and considerably less generous to men who do not." "Is that a threat, Mr. Ashford?" Tobias asked, straightening to his full height, which put several inches and considerably more muscle between himself and the smaller man. "It is a fact," Ashford said, though he had gone slightly pale at Tobias's proximity. "Mr. Finch, that train leaves in 3 hours. I strongly suggest you be aboard it, and that the contents of that satchel remain your own private business, unless you would prefer Mr. Pemberton learn precisely what you intend to do with them." Finch's hands tightened on the satchel's strap, fear plainly warring with resolve in his narrow face. Tobias did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mr. Finch has decided," he said, "to speak with Judge Whitfield and with Miss Collins before that train leaves. I would suggest you not stand in his way." Ashford's eyes flicked between the two of them, calculating, and then he turned on his heel and left without another word, and something about the speed of his departure worried Tobias more than any argument would have. He found Edna 20 minutes later at the freight office, finishing the last of her paperwork, and told her everything in a low, urgent voice, watching her composure crack for just a moment into something raw and furious before she gathered herself and became, once again, entirely, formidably calm. "We need Finch and that satchel at the depot before 4 o'clock, she said, "in front of witnesses where Ashford cannot simply make either of them disappear. Where is Finch now?" "I left him at the telegraph office, told him to wait for us there. They found the telegraph office empty." "He would not have run," Edna said, though worry sharpened her voice. "Not after finally deciding to do right by this." "No," Tobias agreed grimly, already moving toward the door. "But Ashford might have decided to help him along." They reached the depot at 3:30, the platform already crowded with travelers and well-wishers for the 4 o'clock eastbound, steam hissing from the waiting engine, porters calling out final boarding notices. Tobias spotted Finch first, near the far end of the platform, Ashford's hand gripping his elbow with a tightness that was not friendly, steering him steadily toward the last passenger car. "Finch!" Tobias called, pushing through the crowd, and the thin man's head jerked up, relief and fear crossing his face in equal measure. "Let go of him," Edna said, arriving at Tobias's shoulder, her voice cutting clear across the platform noise with authority that turned several nearby heads. "Mr. Finch has changed his mind about Denver," Ashford said smoothly, though his grip did not loosen. "Business matters back in Larkspur. Nothing that concerns you, Miss Collins." "It concerns me a great deal," Edna said, "as does that satchel, which I believe contains evidence relevant to a court proceeding currently before Judge Whitfield." "Mr. Finch, is Mr. Ashford compelling you to leave against your own wishes?" Finch opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Ashford's composure finally broke entirely, and he made a grab for the satchel's strap, wrenching it from Finch's grip with a strength that surprised everyone watching, and turned to shove his way through the crowd toward the platform's edge, clearly intending to fling the satchel and its contents into the gap beneath the waiting train, or simply vanish into the press of bodies with it. He did not get 3 steps. Tobias caught him by the collar with one massive hand, spinning him half around, and Ashford swung wildly with the satchel still clutched in his other fist, catching Tobias a glancing blow across the jaw that did nothing but anger him further. A woman nearby screamed. A porter shouted for order. Tobias, who had spent years wrestling stubborn horses and unforgiving iron, simply closed his hand around Ashford's wrist and squeezed until the man's fingers opened involuntarily, the satchel dropping into Edna's waiting hands before it could fall to the platform boards. "That is assault, Mr. Warren," Ashford gasped, though the fight had visibly gone out of him, his fine coat rumpled, his composure entirely shattered in front of a platform full of witnesses. "That is a man protecting evidence from a thief," came a new voice, and Tobias looked up to see the station agent, drawn by the commotion, along with a uniformed railway constable who had apparently been summoned by the earlier screaming. "Someone want to tell me what in blazes is happening on my platform?" It took some minutes to sort out, with Finch finally finding his courage and speaking plainly in front of the constable, Edna producing her own credentials and explaining the court matter awaiting resolution in Larkspur, and Ashford, cornered and exposed, finally losing what remained of his nerve and admitting, in a stammering rush, that Pemberton had instructed him to prevent Finch from testifying by whatever means necessary, though he insisted, weakly, that he had never intended actual violence. The constable, unimpressed, detained Ashford for questioning regarding the assault on Tobias, while the station agent held the eastbound train an additional quarter-hour, at Edna's calm but insistent request, to allow Finch time to formally withdraw his ticket and agree, of his own free will now, to accompany them back to Larkspur to testify before Judge Whitfield. By the time the platform finally cleared and the train pulled away without Finch aboard it, Edna's hands were shaking with the release of tension, and Tobias realized his own jaw throbbed where Ashford's swing had landed, though he found he did not much mind the ache, given what it had purchased them. "You are bleeding," Edna said, reaching up without thinking to touch the corner of his mouth where a thin cut had opened. "Seems to be a habit of mine around you," Tobias said, and she laughed, a startled, relieved sound that turned into something softer as her hand lingered against his jaw a moment longer than strictly necessary for examining a wound. That evening, with Finch settled at a boarding house under the station agent's watchful arrangement, and the supply wagon fully loaded for the morning's departure, Tobias found Edna sitting alone on the boarding house porch, watching the last light fade over the western ridges. "May I sit?" he asked. She made room beside her without hesitation, and for a while neither of them spoke, the quiet between them comfortable rather than strained. "I owe you an apology," Tobias said finally. "Whatever for? For the way I thought of you when I first saw you rationing those tonics. I thought you were fragile, thought you needed rescuing." He shook his head slowly. "Took me a rockslide, a flooded creek, and a train platform brawl to understand you have been the one holding this settlement together with your own 2 hands since your father died, same as I have with mine, and neither of us needed the other's rescuing nearly so much as we needed the other's company." Edna was quiet a moment, considering that. "I will admit," she said, "that when Judge Whitfield first ordered a mountain man as my escort, I imagined someone rather more concerned with proving his strength than with actually listening to what I needed. I have been pleasantly surprised, Mr. Warren, more times on this journey than I care to count." "Tobias," he said, "I think we have earned first names, given the circumstances." "Tobias," she agreed, and something in the way she said it settled warm and certain in his chest. "For what it is worth, I was jealous of no one on this journey, and yet I found myself entirely unable to stop watching you cross that creek yesterday, waiting to see if you would come out the other side. I do not think that was merely professional concern for my escort's welfare." "No," he agreed quietly, turning to face her fully in the fading light. "I do not think it was." He did not decide to kiss her so much as find himself already doing it, slow and careful, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished. And when she did not, when her hand came up instead to rest against his chest as though steadying herself against something vast and unfamiliar, he understood that whatever had begun on that muddy square in Larkspur had become something neither of them could easily walk back from now, nor did either of them particularly wish to. They left Canyon City before dawn, the wagon heavy with supplies, Aldous Finch riding uneasily alongside them with his satchel of evidence held tight against his chest, and the mountains ahead lit gold with the promise of a clear day. The trail seemed shorter on the return, or perhaps it was only that the company felt lighter, Ashford's absence a relief none of them spoke aloud, and Edna and Tobias found excuse after excuse to ride close together, trading quiet words and quieter glances that Finch, watching from a discreet distance, pretended very hard not to notice. They crossed the creek at a wider, calmer point Tobias remembered from an old trapping trail, the water having dropped a full foot in the days since their outbound crossing, and passed the mudslide with considerably less drama the second time, Edna's mare picking her way across with the confidence of an animal that trusted its rider entirely. "You are different since Canyon City," Finch observed once, riding alongside Tobias while Edna rode ahead to check the trail. "If you do not mind my saying so." "How so?" "You smile more," Finch said, with the faint, tired humor of a man who had spent a very long month being frightened of his own conscience. "It is a good look on you, Mr. Warren. I hope, whatever happens with the judge, that it stays." They reached Larkspur on the 8th day, exactly within Judge Whitfield's deadline, the bridge across the canyon still standing though the river beneath it ran higher and louder than Tobias had ever seen it. Word of their return spread through the settlement within the hour, and by the time they had unloaded the wagon at Edna's apothecary, a good portion of the town had gathered, curious, along with a summons for all parties to appear before Judge Whitfield the following morning to settle the guardianship matter once and for all. Silas Pemberton arrived at the hearing looking considerably less composed than he had the first time, having apparently already heard, through channels Tobias could only guess at, some garbled version of what had happened in Canyon City. His silver-headed cane tapped an anxious rhythm against the floor as Judge Whitfield called the session to order. "Miss Collins," the judge said, "I understand you completed the journey and the resupply within the allotted time. I have also received word from the railway constable in Canyon City regarding an incident on the platform there involving Mr. Ashford, currently detained pending further inquiry, and a Mr. Aldous Finch, whom I understand is present today and wishes to testify." "He is, Your Honor," Edna said, and stepped aside to let Finch approach the judge's table. What followed took the better part of an hour. Finch's halting but ultimately thorough account of the forged transfer, the fresh ink on an old document, the commission Pemberton had quietly collected from the mining syndicate, corroborated by copies of ledger entries he produced from his satchel showing payments that had no legitimate explanation within the bank's official books. Edna, questioned by the judge, laid out her own careful accounting of the estate, demonstrating a command of every detail that left no reasonable person in the room doubting her competence. Tobias testified to what he had witnessed on the platform, and to Ashford's own confession under the constable's questioning. Pemberton, when finally given opportunity to respond, offered only a series of increasingly weak denials that crumbled further with each question the judge put to him, until at last, his face gray, he simply fell silent. "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Whitfield said, in the flat, final tone of a man who had heard enough, "I am terminating your guardianship over Miss Collins's estate effective immediately, and referring the matter of the forged land transfer to the county prosecutor for further investigation, along with the question of your conduct regarding your bank's dealings with the mining syndicate. I would strongly advise you retain counsel. Miss Collins, this court finds you fully competent to manage your own affairs, and formally dissolves any further oversight of your father's estate. The land at the bridge crossing remains yours, free and clear pending resolution of the fraudulent transfer, which I expect the prosecutor will find little difficulty overturning, given the evidence presented today." The room erupted into murmured conversation, and Edna sat very still for a long moment, as though she could not quite believe 2 years of fighting had ended in a single morning before Tobias, standing just behind her, rested a steady hand on her shoulder, and she reached up to cover it with her own. Pemberton was led away by the county sheriff within the week, to face charges that would eventually cost him both his bank and his standing in the settlement entirely, his fine coat and silver cane doing nothing to protect him from a prosecutor who found, upon closer investigation, considerably more forged documents than the single one Finch had uncovered. Ashford, for his part, cooperated fully once he understood the extent of Pemberton's exposure, and avoided the worst of the legal consequences by testifying against his former employer, though he left Larkspur entirely and was never seen in the settlement again. Finch stayed, oddly enough, taking up work as a bookkeeper for the Trading Post, insisting he had grown fond of the mountain air despite everything. And Edna suspected, though she never said so aloud, that he simply could not quite bring himself to leave the place where he had finally chosen to do right by his own conscience. Spring settled fully over the canyon in the weeks that followed, the creeks dropping to their normal courses, the wagon road reopening for regular freight, wildflowers pushing up through mud that had seemed, only weeks before, endless and impassable. Tobias found himself at Edna's apothecary more often than strict necessity required, and Edna found herself at his forge with equal frequency, watching him work with an interest that had very little to do with the tools themselves, and a great deal to do with the man shaping them. "You know," she said one evening, watching him quench a newly forged hinge in a bucket of water, steam rising between them, "the settlement has been saying for weeks that a forge and an apothecary sit rather close together at the bridge crossing, and that it seems a waste for two people with so much reason to see each other daily to keep maintaining separate roofs." "Is that what the settlement has been saying?" Tobias said, wiping his hands on his apron, trying and failing to keep the smile from his voice. Mrs. Doyle mentioned it specifically, in fact. Something about how convenient it would be for a doctor and a blacksmith to share a workshop, given how often the one calls upon the other these days. Mrs. Doyle is a shrewd woman. Tobias set down his tools and crossed the small space between them, taking her hands in his, the calluses of his palms rough against her fingers in a way that had become, over these past weeks, deeply familiar and deeply welcome. "I have been thinking on it myself, if I am honest. There is room enough at the bridge crossing to build something proper. A trading post, maybe, with your apothecary on one side and my forge on the other, and living quarters above, the way my father once had above his own shop back east, before the war took everything from us. Somewhere the whole canyon could rely on, same as they rely on each of us separately now, only together it would be twice the strength." "That sounds," Edna said, her voice gone soft, "like a very sensible business proposal, Mr. Warren." "It is not only a business proposal," he said, and here his voice roughened slightly, the words coming harder than iron ever had beneath his hammer. "Edna Collins, I have shod every horse and mended every tool in this settlement for 3 years, and I never once thought I was lonely doing it, until a woman came riding down out of the east with a satchel full of medicine and a spine made of the same stuff as good steel, and showed me exactly how lonely I had been the whole time. I am not a man given to fine speeches. I can only tell you plainly that I love you, and that I would build you the finest workshop in this canyon and spend every day of my life keeping it standing, if you would have me alongside it." Edna's eyes had gone bright with tears she did not bother hiding, and she reached up to touch the rough line of his jaw, the same gesture from the train platform, though there was nothing tentative in it now. "I came west to continue my father's work," she said, "and I told myself for 2 years that would be enough, that I did not need anything more than purpose to fill the empty places a person can carry inside them. I was wrong, Tobias. I love you as well, and I would be glad, more glad than I know how to say, to spend the rest of my life beside you, in whatever shop we build together, tending whatever this canyon brings to our door, so long as it brings us to each other's doors as well, every single day." He kissed her then, properly, without the hesitance of that first evening on the boarding house porch, and the forge fire behind them burned low and steady, the same fire that had first drawn his attention across the muddy square all those weeks before, when he had watched a proud, exhausted woman ration out her own medicine rather than admit she needed anyone's help at all. They were married by early summer, in a ceremony held right there at the bridge crossing, with the whole settlement in attendance and the river running clear and blue below, tamed back into its familiar banks now that the spring floods had finally passed. Judge Whitfield, passing through on his next circuit, agreed to officiate, remarking with dry humor that he had rarely presided over a case that ended so thoroughly to his satisfaction, nor a wedding that felt so entirely deserved. By autumn, the new building stood finished at the bridge's eastern approach, exactly where Pemberton's forged documents had once tried to claim the land for a mining syndicate's toll road, now serving instead as a trading post that anchored the entire canyon settlement. Tobias's forge occupied one wing, its fire never fully banked, tools and horseshoes and mended plow blades hanging in orderly rows along walls he had built with his own hands. Edna's apothecary filled the other, shelves lined with tonics and tinctures she never again had reason to ration, her father's old scale sitting proudly beside the newer instruments she had purchased with funds finally, fully her own. A sign above the shared entrance read simply *Warren and Collins*, and beneath it, smaller, a line Edna had insisted upon herself: medicine and iron since 1879 *. Aldous Finch kept their books, meticulous to a fault, insisting there would be no fresh ink on old dates ever again so long as he had breath to prevent it. Mrs. Doyle's son Sammy, fully recovered and grown sturdy through the summer, ran errands between the forge and the apothecary for pocket change, and delighted in telling any traveler who passed through about the time the mountain man had ridden through the night for his medicine, embellishing the story a little further with each retelling, until Tobias good-naturedly complained he was being made out to have wrestled a bear along the way. In the evenings, once the last horse was shod and the last tincture measured, Tobias and Edna would sit together on the porch that faced the bridge, watching the canyon settle into twilight, the river running steady beneath them, carrying nothing more dangerous now than the ordinary business of a mountain town going about its life. Tobias would sometimes take her hand in his, rough palm against careful fingers, and think of how close he had come to riding past her wagon that first day without stopping at all, and how grateful he was, every single evening since, that he had not. "No rationing tonight," Edna told him once, teasing, holding up a fresh bottle of the tonic she kept now for her own small aches and pains, stocked as full as anyone's in the canyon. "I have learned my lesson, Mr. Warren. There is no shortage worth suffering alone when there is someone willing to ride through the mud for you." "There never was," Tobias agreed, and drew her close against his side as the last light faded gold over the western ridges, the forge fire banked but never quite cold, the bridge standing steady beneath them, and the whole wide, thawed canyon settling into the kind of quiet that belonged, at last, entirely to the two of them.